Okay, Michael, thank you so much for making time to do this.
My pleasure, Dave. Always delighted to talk to you.
I mean, jumping straight in, the main question for me is, what is it that you do? What are you interested in? Why do you do it?
My interests in life are all about two books I read when I was 5 years old, both by Richard Scarry. One is called Busy, Busy World, which was all about different countries of the world. And the second one was called What Do People Do All Day? And basically, I'm just fascinated in what do people do all day and why in a global sense.
Sure.
And why is this world as it is? And then particularly, why is this world as it is in ways that aren't good? And therefore, how can we make it better?
And what has that led you on to?
Ultimately, it's led me into thinking a lot about economics. Because economics to me is about the choices that we make. It's not about money. It's not about high finance. It's about the choices that we make, and can we make better choices, accepting the realities of the constraints that we live under.
Sure.
And so that's what ultimately led me into thinking about economics in the broad sense from all my career. Not looking at the world as a morality play, looking at the world in how people are rational and that people are responding to rational incentives, and how if we can change the incentives, can we change our behaviours? And therefore it's about how can we pull those levers, change those incentives and make the world a better place without making it just a simple morality play of good people, bad people. Because I think that doesn't explain very much. And actually thinking about the world as people doing the rational thing, behaving rationally, responding to the way they're incentivised to behave, actually explains the world a lot much better than a kind of moral perspective.
In one of the other conversations I've been having, I've been talking with someone about behaviour economics, which isn't a moral play, but also isn't a rational economic play. How does that fit into your world?
Yeah, when I say people are rational, it's not that they're sort of hyper homo economicus rational, calculating things at every moment. But they are doing things that they think are right at different moments, not because it's a moral imperative driving them, or an immoral imperative driving them. It's they're doing what they think is right in those circumstances. And yes, certainly people are sometimes not perfectly rational. And I think that's why behavioural economics has been such an important contribution in thinking about what is the reason why people respond in certain ways.
So there's two sort of chapters of your work that I've been interested in. And the first, I mean, when we met, it was because I had your book on my shelf, Philanthropic Capitalism, and saw that you had followed what we're doing on Twitter and quickly found you 5-6 years ago, and obviously we've talked a lot since, but what was the key thing that you learned through doing Philanthropic Capitalism, interviewing all those mega philanthropists? I
should say, first of all, I mean, I came very reluctantly to the issue of philanthropy.
Okay.
For me, one of the most important experiences I had about philanthropy and charity was doing charity work in Romania, just after the changes, after the death of Ceausescu. And fundraising locally, raising money, being involved in charitable projects, and then being aware about how we'd really failed. And what that kind of taught me was that we as amateurs with our enthusiasm were, in the words of Johnny Rotten of the Sex Pistols, having a cheap holiday in other people's misery. We were having a good time, we were learning a lot, we were having great experience, but we weren't actually doing a lot of good. And in a way, that was what then took me into thinking, well, where are the big levers in our society that can really make a change? And that was why I ended up working in government for a long time. Because I thought, ultimately, if you're talking about whether it's economic or social or political rights, ultimately government can deliver those. And then in a way, after working through government, I came through that and I saw, well, actually, there are things that government can't do. Government is never going to be very innovative. Government's never going to be able to kind of think beyond the short-term political moment. And actually what I was seeing from sitting inside government was how the innovation in our world was often coming from philanthropists, because they were freed from some of the constraints that politicians are under. So I was very much inspired by work that George Soros was doing in Eastern Europe, where I was working at the time, or what Bill Gates was doing about health, on sort of preventing diseases, etc. So I got kind of excited about the way that philanthropy can be this kind of risk capital in society that government money couldn't, and that how people who were willing to take risks and really try and not do the conventional solution actually could make a really big difference in finding new ways of solving problems.
And that's how you arrived at Philanthropic Capitalism and that whole project. What was surprising about the project? What did you learn that you didn't expect to find?
Well, I went into it actually being quite open-minded about, is this a good thing or not? I mean, I took a sabbatical from government, and lots of my colleagues said, isn't this quaint? You're exploring this 19th century phenomenon of philanthropy. They're repeating all the mistakes that we've made. It's just a load of old rubbish. And so I just didn't know what the answer was. But when going into it, I could see how, you know, the really smart philanthropists were doing things that other people couldn't.
Yeah.
And could be part of a system in our society to solve problems. One of the most surprising and important things that Bill Gates told us when we interviewed him was the Gates Foundation is a tiny, tiny organisation. Now, no one thinks, you know, tens of billion-dollar endowment foundation is a tiny organisation, but it is relative to the problems it's trying to solve.
Yes, yeah.
So he's always had to think about how does his philanthropy fit into the system and leverage the system, change incentives in the system, get other people to behave differently. And that's what I think smart philanthropy does. It sees itself as being part of a system that it's trying to influence.
I've never heard philanthropy described as risk capital for society. It's kind of free-flowing money based out of a place of passion and interest, often because of people's personal journeys and problems or stuff that has occurred to them along the way. Would you go as far to say that a good use of philanthropy is to go for the most ambitious and risky projects, because that is the stuff that can create quantum leaps that other more less risky or more risk-adverse institutions can then begin to adopt?
Exactly. I mean, if I have a critique of philanthropy, is it doesn't do crazy enough things.
Right, yeah.
You know, it is very rarely that I look up hashtag philanthropy on Twitter and I'm spluttering into my cornflakes about how daring and bold an idea there is.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that's a problem.
Yeah.
And I think the danger of philanthropy now is people are pushing it to become a bit like all the other capital that's available in the world. We all end up following best practice and failing together, and therefore everyone's happy. Whereas actually you want the people who will try the crazy ideas. The 90% of the time will fail, but 10% of the time with a breakthrough no one's thought about.
Exactly.
And that's what philanthropy's got to be.
I guess it's more efficient to fail in different ways than to fail in the same way.
And learn from that failure.
Indeed.
And I think, again, another problem I think with the philanthropic world is there's not enough conversation about failure.
Yeah.
Everyone's got to succeed in some ways.
Yeah.
And so, you know, Matthew Bishop, my co-author, and I have talked in the past about someone should fund a prize for heroic failures in philanthropy.
Sure.
To really celebrate that.
Change the conversation a little bit.
Yeah, because I think if philanthropy can't talk about failure, it's failing.
Well, why don't you tell us more about what you're doing now?
Someone asked us to write an article about why can a for-profit idea go from start-up to massive scale in a short period of time, whereas social innovation seems to never grow. And so we wrote this article called The Capital Curve for a Better World. And what we were arguing was, in a sense, if you're a for-profit idea, there's a very clear sort of capital curve by which you can grow to scale, from sort of, you know, friends, fools and family, to your angel investors, to your venture capital, and then on to your IPO or whatever. That's quite a clear path. Whereas if you've got social innovation, there isn't such a clear path of capital growth. And also what has got to happen is you often have to jump sectors, that you may start off as a small non-profit, but at some point you've got to get philanthropy interested, which is a different kind of funder. At some point, to get to real scale, you've either got to turn it into a for-profit idea that the markets will fund, or you've got to get government to fund it. So that actually involves collaboration between different sectors, or you've got to allow the conversation to occur across different sectors. And what was missing to help those ideas reach scale was a common language about what social returns really mean. And so through a very long process, what we came to was what we now call the Social Progress Index, which is a way of measuring the performance of societies entirely in non-economic ways. Because what we found, to our surprise in a way, was that nothing existed that was doing that already. That you had some measures of society's performance that were about social issues, but they tended to mix up economic and social ideas. So the United Nations Human Development Index has economic and social measures all combined in one. Or there was kind of an apartheid system. There would be sort of social measures for poor countries, the Millennium Development Goals, which wouldn't be relevant to rich countries. And then there would be sort of social indicators for rich countries held by the OECD, but nothing that was creating a holistic measure for the whole continuum of countries, rich and poor.
Sure. You have like 12 indicators of a society that is doing well in a holistic way. I think you break those into three main themes now.
Yeah.
And what would they be?
So first of all, social progress is about whether or not you're living in a good society,
Yeah.
not about living in a happy society.
Okay.
It's possible to live in a good unhappy society or a bad happy society. Now, often the two will overlap, but they're conceptually very different. So we're looking at, are you a good society? So we then define a good society as, first of all, does everyone in your society have their basic needs met? Food, water, shelter, safety. Secondly, what we call foundations of well-being. Does everyone in your society have a chance to improve their life? Do they have the tools and assets that will help them improve their lives? Education, information, health, and a sustainable environment. And then the third aspect is, does every individual have the opportunities to pursue their dreams and aspirations without impediment? Does everyone have rights, freedom of choice, freedom from discrimination, and a chance to access the world's most advanced knowledge? So it's these basic human needs, foundations of well-being and opportunity are the three basic dimensions of the model.
And what have you found?
Actually, economic development is pretty good for us. That social progress does go up with economic development. The more resources that we have means that we can build more hospitals, we can provide more teachers. You know, there's something positive about that. We've not been doing the wrong thing throughout the centuries and trying to get more economic growth. That's sort of the good news.
Yeah.
But the second thing we find out is that, you know, economic growth is particularly good if you're a poor country.
Yeah.
But once you hit a certain level of GDP per capita, about $10,000 per year, the rate of increase of social progress with each extra dollar of GDP starts to slow down.
Okay.
So that means for countries like the UK or other, even middle-income countries, GDP cannot be the be-all and end-all. There's not a perfect relationship between GDP and social progress.
Right.
Or to put it another way, GDP is not destiny.
Yes.
At any particular level of GDP, there are opportunities for more social progress or risks of less. And so there are things about government policies, structure of the non-profit sector, the way the private sector behaves, that are really important for social progress beyond just economic growth.
There is a big bandwidth, essentially, where they could be more progressed or less progressed based on what other factors?
That's what we're trying to figure out, what those other factors are. Yeah. But we think it's something to do with what are the government policies, what's the nature of the society. I mean, the example I always think about is Bangladesh and Pakistan. Bangladesh has a level of social progress higher than Pakistan, even though it's a lot poorer.
Right.
Why is that?
Yeah.
Well, one thing you can be pretty certain about is nothing to do with good government in Bangladesh. So it's probably something to do with people like Muhammad Yunus, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on microfinance, and other institutions in Bangladesh that somehow have filled that gap and created an amazing set of innovations that have really lifted people out of poverty. And so what we want to do, now we've got this measure of the outcome, we can drill in and start saying, well, what are those policies? What kind of health policies are good for people's outcomes? What kind of education policies give better outcomes? What kinds of civic structures are good? Is it better to have a culture that's got more giving, a culture that's got a strong civil society? You know, what are those characteristics that help get you more social progress for every dollar of GDP?
Absolutely. Have you seen there being important components of the gift economy, of people giving this risk capital or philanthropy? Do you have any findings to show that? And what's your hunch?
Let me start with the hunch. I mean, my hunch would be that there's actually a lot of value that we have about the society we live in that isn't about material things. It's about the quality of our social relationships. It's whether I go out onto the street and got to feel safe and feel that I'm part of a community. It won't just be about getting more and more stuff, but then we live in our own houses having to buy our friends or buy gates to keep people out. It's got to be about something that is living in a community is something that is good for us as human beings, because we are social beings who like living in communities. So that's my kind of intuitive hunch. We certainly know that it's that more economic output alone is not sufficient to make a good society. I would also be pretty clear to say it can't be big government alone. I think government's had a really important role in delivering basic services, basic rights. But I think the challenges we face as societies now, whether it's about sort of, ageing and morbidity and those kind of health issues, are not solved just by government policies. They've got to be about how we as a society interact with each other. And so I think those kind of social relationships are going to become ever more important issues for the world in the 21st century.
So would it be fair to say that in your previous work, you've seen that philanthropy at large can be good risk capital for society, and that in the current work you're doing, you've got a hunch that neither trade nor big government alone hold the answers, not necessarily directly in itself, but giving could hold some of the answers that we need if we take it seriously and go for the ambitious projects that are solving the biggest problems.
There's one component we have of them all. One of the 12 components of the Social Progress Index is what we call health and wellness. And this includes things like life expectancy, but as well as how long people are living, we're also looking at sort of morbidity issues as well. So we're asking about whether people are suffering from obesity or whether they're suffering from mental health issues. And that component is really interesting because it has a very strange relationship with economic development. Certainly it's true that richer countries don't necessarily do better on that measure. So we measure 132 countries, and on that measure the United States is 70th.
Wow.
And now this also is a country that spends more than any other country in the world on health care, on medicine and doctors. But actually our health and well-being seems to be nothing to do with how much we spend on doctors and medicines. It's actually about something else. It's going to be about diet, it's going to be about lifestyle, it's going to be about how we feel in our societies. And I think that's what's the really important thing, is that it's not just about the brute force of technology to throw medical solutions at us. It's about our quality of life in a society that I think really, really matters. And a giving society is a society that's going to be much more supportive to the individual than something that's a selfish society. So I think it's giving fundamentally. It's got to be part of the makeup of a healthy society.
It's interesting how these different conversations interrelate, because 2 weeks ago in Stanford I was interviewing Jim Doty, who's a neuroscientist, and some of their studies there have shown dramatic life expectancy increases through an active giving lifestyle. There is a sense that there's a gap, that trade and government don't have the answers. If we can be ambitious with our giving and do it together, it's got as good a shot as any at solving some of the social fabric gaps and solving some of the big problems in our lives. That's got to be worth a punt.
I think also it's about giving is also, I think what's really effective is about crossing boundaries. It's not seeing people as others. It's not seeing giver and recipient. It's not seeing rich and poor. And I think that's what we need in our society. I think we're living in a world where, because of technology, because of communications, we rub alongside each other a lot more than we did in the past, people who are different. And to get on with being different, we have to learn to communicate, and we have to get outside of our little boxes about how this is me and that's other. We have to be able to communicate. And I think giving actually is part of that, in a kind of extrovert way, about expressing who we are, but in a generous way unto others, and allowing them to do that to us. It's about building that kind of dialogue.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
I'll see you soon, no doubt.
Cheers then.
Cheers.